There are moments in celebrity history that feel rehearsed, polished, managed, carefully staged to look spontaneous. And then there are the moments no one sees coming, the kind that don't just shift public perception, but swallow it whole. So let's start with a question that's been echoing louder than anyone expected. What happens when the quietest person in the room finally decides to speak? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. People have spent years speculating about Meghan Markle's past, her rise, her strategy, her timing. But the one person who never fueled the conversation was Doria Ragland, silent, composed, almost invisible at times. Which is why the world stopped when whispers began circulating that Doria had allegedly revealed something on air that no one was prepared for. A single sentence, a calm voice, no drama in the delivery. But the meaning? Explosive. She planned her future in phases. And nothing ever happened by accident. Let that sit with you for a second. Because if that statement is true, even as speculation, it doesn't just change how people view Meghan's journey. It changes the entire timeline. Every decision, every relationship, every pivot that once looked like coincidence suddenly feels intentional. So the real question becomes, why now? Why would Doria, after decades of silence, suddenly step into the conversation? And more importantly, what changed behind the scenes before that moment ever reached a microphone? This isn't a story about scandal for the sake of shock. It's about timing, power, control, and the uncomfortable reality that the truth doesn't always surface when someone loses control. Sometimes it comes out when they think they've already won. But let's slow down before jumping ahead, because the beginning matters. You see, most stories about Meghan start at the same place. Childhood, ambition, mixed race identity, a young girl caught between worlds. It's a narrative that's been polished into something inspiring, almost cinematic. But there's a difference between a story and a script. One evolves naturally, the other is designed. And the first hint that something didn't match the public version wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. A shift in tone here, a contradiction in detail there. The type of inconsistencies that don't mean much on their own, until you line them up. That's when the pattern appears. But here's where things get interesting. The people closest to Meghan never publicly challenged the narrative. Not her father. Not extended family. Not even Doria, who, despite being present in the major milestones, remained largely silent in between. Which brings us back to today. Why would a woman who mastered silence suddenly step into the noise? And what did she know that made her choose this moment? Not 5 years ago, not 10, but right now. Because timing is never random in stories like this. Not when reputations are involved. Not when influence is at stake. And certainly not when the public mood has shifted from fascination to suspicion. You may have noticed it yourself. There was a time when Meghan was everywhere. Magazine covers, interviews, special features, headlines that bordered on worship. But attention is not loyalty. The same media that builds someone up will eventually pivot, sometimes slowly, sometimes brutally. The turn didn't happen overnight. It began the moment the narrative stopped matching the reactions. Public sympathy turned into public confusion. Confusion turned into exhaustion. And exhaustion, more than anything, creates opportunity. Because that's the moment when people finally start asking questions they ignored before. Questions like, was this all coincidence? Or was there a blueprint? Was this a fairy tale gone wrong? Or a strategy that reached its limit? And if Doria really did hint that every phase was intentional, what was the final phase meant to be? But we're not there yet. Right now, we're still at the threshold, the point where a story starts to unravel, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a hairline fracture that slowly widens until the structure can no longer hold. You've seen this pattern before. A celebrity rises. A celebrity polarizes. A celebrity retreats. But rarely do we see the person closest to them become the accelerant. That's what makes this different. Because Doria wasn't a critic. She wasn't a rival. She wasn't a scorned family member looking for a spotlight. She was the one person everyone assumed would remain neutral forever. Which means her alleged words, true or not, land differently. They don't sound like gossip. They sound like confirmation. But confirmation of what? That's the part no one is saying yet. And until that missing piece appears, the world is left with a sentence that reads less like commentary and more like a warning. She planned her future in phases. So let's consider that possibility, not as fact, but as a hypothesis. If someone builds their life in phases, it means nothing is spontaneous. Nothing is emotional. Every step leads to the next step. Every move has a destination, which raises another question. What happens when a plan designed for forward motion suddenly hits a wall? Does the person adapt? Or do they panic? Because retreat doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's regrouping. And sometimes it's the moment before everything comes out. But we're still in the opening chapter. The calm before the narrative flips. And if the whispers surrounding Doria's alleged remarks carry any truth, then what she revealed on air wasn't the climax. It was the trigger. The spark that set off something much bigger. Which brings us to the moment we are standing in right now. A moment where Meghan, once untouchable in public perception, is suddenly facing the type of scrutiny that doesn't fade with time. Scrutiny from the media, former allies, public opinion, and now, if the rumors are accurate, from inside her own circle. But the biggest twist? The part Doria allegedly shared wasn't even the beginning. And the beginning is where we go next. Because before the wedding, before the interviews, before the royal exit, before the global headlines, there was the first phase, quiet, overlooked, barely mentioned. And yet, according to those who claim to have seen the pattern forming, it was the foundation for everything that followed. Which means if we want to understand the fallout, we have to understand the origin. And once you see how it started, you'll never look at how it unfolded the same way again. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Let's go back. Not to the wedding, not to the palace gates, not to the televised love story that captivated the world, but to the first moment the narrative didn't quite match the reaction it received. Because every major public unraveling starts long before anyone notices. The warning signs are always there. People just don't recognize them until they're looking backward. Think about every celebrity who fell from grace. It's never the headline that destroys them. It's the pattern people suddenly realize was forming the entire time. A strange detail, a repeated contradiction, a missing explanation. At first, no one questions it. Why would they? When someone rises, the world wants to believe. But eventually, the version of events becomes too polished, too curated, too consistent for reality. And that's when doubt slips in quietly, like a draft under a locked door. Meghan's story wasn't doubted at the beginning. In fact, it was the opposite. People embraced it. A biracial American actress marrying into one of the most traditional institutions in the world. It was the kind of narrative that made history feel like it was modernizing right in front of us. But somewhere along the timeline, admiration turned into hesitation. And hesitation turned into questions. Not because people suddenly became cynical, but because the details weren't aligning anymore. The interviews didn't match the timelines. The public statements didn't match the visible outcomes. And the more Meghan tried to control the message, the more uncontrollable the reaction became. But here's the part most people overlook. Doria remained silent through all of it. Not supportive in interviews. Not defensive on talk shows. Not contradicting anyone. Just present, physically in major moments, emotionally unreadable. Silence is often mistaken for agreement. But silence can also be neutrality, distance, observation. And sometimes, silence is the only thing someone can offer when truth would burn every bridge around them. So the fact that Doria allegedly broke that silence now, that's what makes this moment feel like a turning point. Because if she truly said that nothing in Meghan's life happened by accident, then it challenges the central belief that Meghan was swept into something overwhelming and reacted from survival. It suggests something else entirely. Preparation. Not in a sinister way, but in a deliberate way. A way that makes you wonder whether the world fell in love with a story that was never as spontaneous as it appeared. But let's ask the question that no one has dared to ask out loud. If Meghan planned her future in phases, then what phase are we in right now? Is this the crisis phase? The reinvention phase? The quiet retreat before the next move? Or is this the moment where the plan finally stopped working? Because every strategy has an expiration date, especially the ones built on public perception. The audience always catches up eventually. It doesn't matter how compelling the narrative is. Once people feel manipulated instead of inspired, they turn. And when they turn, the fall is not gradual. It's instant. One day you're celebrated. The next day you're questioned. The day after that, you're avoided. We've seen it happen to politicians, actors, influencers, billionaires. The common thread isn't the scandal, it's the timing. The fall only happens after people feel the story no longer belongs to them, but is being controlled for them. And that's when the backlash begins. So when whispers began circulating that Doria allegedly revealed something on air, the reaction wasn't shock. It was confirmation for people who had already sensed that something was off. Because the public is not irrational. They don't turn on someone without a reason. They turn when the emotional contract breaks. And somewhere along the line, that's exactly what happened. But there's another layer beneath all of this, one the media hasn't fully examined yet. For years, Meghan and Doria have been portrayed as an unbreakable unit. Two against the world. Silent loyalty. Mutual protection. So the idea that Doria would say anything that could be interpreted as exposing Meghan doesn't just shift the narrative. It rewrites the relationship. And that's the part no one is prepared for. Because if the one person Meghan trusted the most allegedly allowed even a fragment of truth to surface, then something had already fractured long before the world heard it. People don't speak when everything is fine. People speak when the cost of staying silent becomes heavier than the cost of being honest. Which leads to a question that changes the angle of this entire story. Did Doria speak out because she wanted to, or because she had no choice? There is a difference. A voluntary reveal suggests frustration. A forced reveal suggests pressure. And pressure only happens when there is something, seen or unseen, that threatens to surface without your control. So what was building behind the scenes? Was it media exposure? Legal concerns? Family tension? Financial entanglements? Or something deeper, something personal? No one knows yet. That's why this moment feels like the calm before the avalanche. The kind where everyone senses that something big is coming, but no one knows which direction it's going to fall. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. The most damaging information never drops from enemies. It comes from the inside. But here's the twist. The alleged statement Doria made doesn't reveal anything specific. It doesn't name names. It doesn't expose actions. It doesn't detail events. It only suggests intent. And intent is far more dangerous than information. Because once people believe someone operated strategically, every past event gets reinterpreted under that lens. A coincidence becomes a step. A relationship becomes a transaction. A struggle becomes a calculated pivot. A retreat becomes planning. Even if it isn't true, once perception shifts, reality doesn't matter anymore. So the next phase of this story isn't about proving what Meghan did or didn't plan. It's about how the world reacts to the possibility that she planned anything at all. Because perception is the real currency here. And right now, it's volatile. Which brings us to the moment we're stepping into. The moment where the past is no longer shielded by silence, and the future is no longer protected by image. The moment where the first phase finally comes into view. Not the fairy tale. Not the royal chapter. Not the public fallout. The part before all of that. The part almost no one ever talks about. The part that, according to those who claim to know, holds the key to everything that followed. And once we go there, nothing about this story will look the same again. Because what comes next doesn't just change the timeline. It changes the entire narrative. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every story has a starting point. Not the one everyone repeats, not the one polished for documentaries or magazine profiles, but the real beginning. The one hidden under layers of retelling until no one remembers what actually happened anymore. And in Meghan Markle's case, the starting point isn't where people think it is. It doesn't begin with the acting. It doesn't begin with Hollywood. And it definitely doesn't begin with royalty. It begins with a missing piece. A silence. A gap that no one questioned at the time. Because why would they? When a person rises suddenly, the world tends to fill in the blanks with whatever feels inspiring. But blank spaces don't stay blank forever. Eventually, someone asks the question that should have been asked from the beginning. If everything went exactly as planned, then when did the planning start? Let's sit with that. Most public narratives about Meghan paint her as someone who was swept into extraordinary circumstances. A normal girl with big dreams, suddenly caught in a whirlwind of fame, pressure, and scrutiny. It's a compelling story. It feels relatable. It makes people root for her. But then something interesting happened. The more Meghan spoke publicly, the less that story held together. Not because people wanted to doubt her, but because the details shifted depending on when and where they were told. A childhood described one way in one interview sounded different in another. A family memory highlighted emotionally in a documentary didn't appear the same in earlier statements. Timelines blurred. Origins changed shape. Small things, barely noticeable at first. But small things matter when a narrative depends on consistency. Here's the part most people forget. Public sympathy isn't based on perfection, it's based on trust. And once trust begins to wobble, even slightly, people start revisiting the beginning with new eyes. So let's do that. Not with judgment, not with assumption, but with curiosity. Because the earliest phase of Meghan's life, the one before the fame, before the spotlight, before the media obsession, holds a silence that is strangely strategic. Teachers, neighbors, extended family, people who would normally speak up during a rise to global fame. Most didn't. Not out of loyalty, necessarily. Not out of malice, either. They just stayed quiet. Silence is never accidental in a public story. It either means there's nothing to say, or that saying something would change too much. So the question becomes, which one was it? Was Meghan's early life simply uneventful and private? Or was it the first phase of a carefully controlled narrative, one that would only make sense in hindsight? Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, let's ground this properly. Nothing here claims that Meghan was plotting a royal marriage from childhood. That's not the point. The point is that patterns almost always start earlier than people realize. Think of celebrities who later admitted they always intended to become famous. Their early classmates remembered them differently. Not as quiet dreamers, but as people who positioned themselves early. Not out of arrogance, out of clarity. So let's ask the direct question. Was Meghan always 3 steps ahead? It's not about villainizing. It's about understanding. Because if her mother, years later, allegedly hinted that Meghan planned her life in phases, then the first phase didn't start in adulthood. It started when no one was paying attention. And the interesting part? The early environment around Meghan wasn't chaotic in the public sense. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with the kind of turbulence that usually shapes celebrity narratives. Instead, it was defined by movement, changes in structure, changes in influence, changes in household dynamics. Not explosive, but formative. People underestimate subtle beginnings because they expect dramatic ones. But the most powerful transformation doesn't start loudly. It starts quietly. When someone realizes the world isn't going to hand them anything, and they will have to design their own path. And according to those who saw Meghan growing up, ambition wasn't something she developed later. It was there early. A drive, a focus, a certainty that didn't match her age. Not unusual, but noticeable. Have you ever met someone who didn't just dream, but expected their dreams to happen? That's the difference. And when someone operates with that level of determination, their early interactions start looking less random and more intentional, at least from the outside. School connections, social positioning, extracurricular choices, not in a sinister way, in a directional way. A person doesn't need a royal target to be strategic. They just need an internal compass that points somewhere bigger than where they are. And Meghan always seemed to have that. Even her early exposure to different environments played a role. She didn't grow up in a bubble. She moved between social worlds, 1 foot in one culture, 1 foot in another, 1 foot in privilege, 1 foot outside of it. That creates adaptability. And adaptability, when refined, becomes strategy. It allows someone to read rooms, adjust personas, shift presentation depending on the environment. Not manipulation, survival, at least at first. But survival skills have a way of transforming into tools. And tools have a way of becoming weapons when the stakes get higher. So when people later claimed that Meghan could reinvent herself seamlessly, they weren't describing something new. They were describing something practiced, long before anyone noticed. But here's where the tension starts building. If the first phase of Meghan's life was defined by positioning rather than randomness, then what was the goal at that stage? Fame? Security? Validation? Escape? Because people don't form strategy without motive. And to understand motive, you have to look at environment, not the public version, but the internal one. Not the smiling photographs, not the polished anecdotes. The space between them. That's where the truth usually lives. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're still in the beginning. The moment before the pattern becomes visible, when the world sees nothing remarkable happening, but the foundation is quietly forming underneath. And according to the people who later claimed to recognize it, the first phase wasn't about opportunity. It was about access, not to royalty, not to fame, but to rooms that would eventually lead there. And if that's true, if the first phase was about positioning rather than chance, then the next step in the sequence wasn't accidental either. In fact, some say it was the most calculated move of all. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming that if the earliest phase of Meghan's life was about access, then the question becomes, access to what? People assume access means fame, elite social circles, or celebrity influence. But that's not usually how early phases work. Before someone reaches the top, they focus on entering rooms that are just one step above where they are, not 10. Because strategy doesn't leap, it climbs. And climbing requires proximity to opportunity, to visibility, to people who can unlock the next phase. So what did proximity look like for Meghan in the earliest stage? It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't flashy. It was observant, quiet, slow. The type of positioning that doesn't draw attention because it isn't supposed to, yet. Teachers remembered her as confident. Peers remembered her as poised. Adults remembered her as unusually composed. Rare qualities in a young person. Unless they've already learned something most adults don't learn until much later. Control the perception, and you control the outcome. But perception isn't shaped instantly. It's shaped through repetition. And Meghan developed a skill that would follow her throughout her life. One that set her apart long before anyone realized it. She understood how to present herself. Not just physically, socially. The right tone, the right reactions, the right charm at the right moment. That isn't accidental. It's learned. And here's where the first contradiction appears. Not in Meghan's story, but in how others interpreted it. People assumed her confidence came from certainty. But some who observed her early years believed it came from adaptation. There's a difference. Certainty is rooted in identity. Adaptation is rooted in necessity. When someone learns to adapt repeatedly, they become fluent in reinvention. And reinvention can look like authenticity until it doesn't. Which leads to another question. Did Meghan reinvent herself out of ambition or out of survival? Because the motivation matters. One creates momentum. The other creates resilience. But both can lead to the same outcome. A person who never stays in one place for long. Not socially, not emotionally, not strategically. And that brings us to the most overlooked element of Phase 1. Movement. People often describe Meghan's early environment as unstable. Others describe it as enriching. Both interpretations can be true at once. Because movement affects people differently depending on how they process it. Some children feel displaced. Others feel adaptable. A few see opportunity. And opportunity is where strategy begins. If a child learns early that they can shift environments without losing their footing, they grow up believing that transition is power. They learn that they can enter new spaces without being swallowed by them. That kind of psychological flexibility becomes a lifelong advantage. It creates someone who isn't intimidated by change. In fact, they initiate it. But there is a subtle cost to that skill. A person who learns to shift repeatedly may never fully attach to any version of themselves. They attach to outcomes instead. And outcomes are much easier to replace than identities. That's not criticism. It's context. Because if Phase 1 was about adaptation, then Phase 2 wasn't accidental. It was the upgrade. But before we go there, there's something else worth examining. A silence hiding in plain sight. When most people rise into global fame, those around them emerge with stories. Former classmates, old friends, family acquaintances. Not to expose them, but to validate them. To say, I knew them before the world did. This is who they were. But with Meghan, that chorus never really formed. Not loudly, not consistently. Some spoke. Some stayed quiet. Some contradicted one another. The result wasn't clarity. It was static. And static always means one of two things. Either the story is so ordinary that no one remembers it clearly, or the story has been curated so carefully that no one feels comfortable filling in the blanks. So which one was it? Let's consider both possibilities. Maybe Meghan's early years really were simple, normal, unremarkable. Maybe there was nothing unusual to report, nothing controversial to reveal, nothing dramatic to reframe. If that's true, then silence makes sense. But if that's not the case, if the early phase contained complexity that didn't match the public version, then silence becomes something else. Protection, containment, control. And control is a recurring theme in Meghan's later life. Even critics and supporters agree on one thing. She is intentional about what she shares, about what she withholds, about how she frames her story. That level of narrative management doesn't begin in adulthood. It is practiced long before anyone notices. So when Doria allegedly said that Meghan planned her future in phases, the statement didn't sound random. It sounded aligned with something people already sensed but couldn't articulate. Not that Meghan planned every event, but that she planned her positioning. There is a difference. People cannot control circumstances. They can control preparation. And preparation is what Phase 1 appears to have been. But here's where the tension sharpens. If Phase 1 was about access, and Phase 2 was about proximity, then there had to be a point where the transition became visible, where the strategy moved from passive to active. That moment didn't happen publicly. It happened quietly, behind closed doors, in small decisions, in private shifts that would only make sense later. No dramatic announcement, no visible transformation, just a pivot. Every life has one, a moment that changes the direction without revealing the destination. It can be a new environment, a new relationship, a new influence. And according to those who later connected the dots, Meghan's pivot wasn't random. It was timed, not to opportunity, to readiness. Because a plan doesn't advance when the world is prepared. It advances when the person is. And once she reached that point, the next phase began, not gradually, but decisively. A new circle, a new trajectory, a new level of ambition. But what happened next wasn't just a step forward. It was the step that made the future inevitable. Because Phase 2 didn't just change the path. It changed the target. And everything that followed, from the relationships to the reinventions to the rise into the global spotlight, can be traced back to that first, almost invisible shift. Which means the story we think begins in Hollywood actually started long before anyone noticed. And once you understand that, you begin to see the pattern forming. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. And quiet beginnings are always the most dangerous ones, because no one sees them forming until it's too late to stop the momentum. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Phase 1 wasn't about the spotlight. Everyone assumes that. They think the beginning of Meghan Markle's rise started with auditions, red carpets, and Hollywood ambition. But what if the truth is quieter than that? What if the first real phase wasn't about being seen at all? What if it was about getting close? Because according to those who now look back on that early pattern, Phase 1 positioned her. Phase 2 activated her. And activation never begins in the public eye. It begins with access, not to fame, but to people. So here's the question that opens everything. If Phase 1 was preparation, then who, or what, was Phase 2 designed to reach? People imagine success as a straight climb. They picture someone going from unknown to noticed to famous. But strategy doesn't move in straight lines. It moves sideways first, right into the orbit of opportunity. And that's exactly what happened next. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to shift the center of gravity. Some describe this stage as coincidence. Others describe it as timing. But those who believe Doria's alleged statement, she planned her future in phases, see it differently. They see a pattern. The pattern begins with the circles Meghan began entering. Not elite, not royal, but elevated. A step above the life she came from. A step below the life she would eventually reach. The kind of middle space where influence develops before anyone recognizes it. Here's what makes that significant. People don't jump from ordinary life to global platform overnight. First, they gain proximity. Not to power, just to more options. And during this stage, something subtle changed in Meghan's choices. Her social sphere shifted. Her ambitions sharpened. Her environment widened. But there was another shift happening at the same time. Something even more revealing. Her relationships began to reflect direction. Not romantically, strategically. Have you ever noticed that some people don't just make friends, they make alignments? They don't network. They position. It's not cold. It's not calculated in a villainous way. It's intentional. Because to move up, you don't chase a destination. You move closer to the people already walking in that direction. And that's exactly what Phase 2 looked like. Not chasing fame, chasing access, not to celebrity itself, but to the worlds adjacent to it. Someone once described Hollywood as an escalator going down. You have to run just to stay in place. So the people who rise aren't always the most talented, they're the most strategic. They understand the rules no one teaches. Visibility matters less than association. Talent matters less than placement. Luck matters less than leverage. And leverage begins with proximity. But here's where the story takes a more interesting turn. Not because of what changed around Meghan, but because of what changed in her approach. During Phase 1, Meghan adapted. During Phase 2, she advanced. Those are not the same thing. Adaptation is reactive. Advancement is deliberate. And this is the point where those who later re-examine the timeline start to see the first signs of long-term planning. Not in the outcome, but in the pattern. The types of rooms she entered. The types of people she connected with. The types of opportunities she pursued. It wasn't random anymore. It was directional. But here's something most people overlook. You cannot enter new spaces without leaving others behind. And that is exactly what happened. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually enough that no one questioned it. Old connections faded. New ones formed. Identity shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. Because before someone reinvents their public image, they reinvent their private expectations. They stop asking, "Can I do this?" and start asking, "How far can this go?" That mental shift is the true beginning of Phase 2. But the most revealing part of this transition wasn't who Meghan began associating with. It was who she did not bring with her. People assume reinvention is about addition. But the more telling sign is subtraction. Who disappears? What gets edited out? Which parts of the past no longer fit the future being built? And in Meghan's case, the edits began early. The narrative became streamlined. The details became more polished. The story became more controlled. Control is not accidental. It is practiced. And that is why, years later, when Doria allegedly hinted that nothing in Meghan's life happened by accident, the idea didn't sound shocking. It sounded familiar, because the seeds were already there. But Phase 2 wasn't about image yet. It was about moving from visibility to trajectory. And trajectory requires something that separates ambitious people from strategic ones. Timing. People think opportunities are rare. They're not. Timing is rare. And Meghan always seemed to move at the exact moment when the next step became available. Not sooner, not later. That kind of instinct isn't luck. It's awareness. But awareness alone doesn't create momentum. Something, or someone, has to trigger the shift. And according to those who later connected the dots, the trigger for Phase 2 wasn't fame. It was access to a new circle, one that would eventually lead to doors opening in ways no one could predict yet. But what came next didn't just change her environment. It changed the target. And once that target shifted, everything that followed became inevitable. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. To understand Phase 2, you have to stop thinking about success as a destination and start thinking about it as a sequence. Because people who move with intention don't wait for life to hand them opportunities. They build the staircase one plank at a time. And that's exactly what began unfolding. Not dramatically, not publicly, not through headline-worthy events, but through small, precise steps that quietly repositioned Meghan from someone orbiting opportunity to someone entering the perimeter. Here's the part most people overlook. Strategic people don't announce transitions. They become them. And during this phase, Meghan began doing something that would define every chapter that followed. She stopped fitting into environments and started selecting them. There is a difference. Fitting in is reactive. Selecting is directional. And once someone begins selecting their environment, the future stops being accidental. So what did selection look like at this stage? Not fame, not royalty, not immediate visibility. It looked like alignment. Aligning with people who were already connected to industries she hadn't entered yet. Aligning with spaces that led outward, not inward. Aligning with networks where ambition wasn't unusual, it was expected. Because the fastest way to change your life isn't to become someone new. It's to stop staying where the old version of you was expected to remain. And that's when the pattern becomes unmistakable. People who later reflected on Meghan's early 20s described something subtle but consistent. She wasn't waiting. She was moving. Every year, a new step. Every step, a new access point. Every access point, a new proximity. Not explosive, Not chaotic, incremental. But incremental momentum is more powerful than sudden success because no one sees it coming until it's already irreversible. And here's where the irony sharpens. Most rising figures accumulate a support system around them. Meghan shed one. Not out of hostility, not out of scandal, out of direction. People drifted. Communication faded. The past became distant. That doesn't make someone cold. It makes someone committed. Because when someone is climbing, the weight they carry determines how high they rise. And Meghan started traveling light. No excess ties. No lingering history. No emotional anchors. Intentional or instinctive, it led to the same result. Phase 2 became motion without noise. But motion always has a purpose. So what was it? Some believe it was career positioning. Some believe it was social elevation. Some believe it was long-term visibility. But the people who connect the dots through Doria's alleged statement see it differently. They don't believe Phase 2 was about becoming someone. They believe it was about reaching someone. Proximity to influence. Not the highest level. Not yet. But higher than before. Think of it like a chess opening. Not to win immediately, but to control the board. And that's when the first meaningful shift appeared, not in Meghan's environment, but in her expectations. Ambition evolved from desire into structure. She wasn't just pursuing opportunity anymore. She was pacing it. People who pace ambition are dangerous in the most fascinating way, not because they are reckless, but because they are patient. Patience in strategy is a superpower. It means someone isn't chasing validation. They're waiting for position. And waiting is only possible when someone knows something others don't. Their moment is coming. But here's the twist. Phase 2 was not glamorous. It wasn't meteoric. It wasn't effortless. It was grinding. Auditions that didn't lead anywhere. Roles that didn't guarantee security. Visibility without recognition. Most people would have quit. But quitting only happens when someone is unsure of their destination. Meghan wasn't unsure. Even critics acknowledge this. She is persistent. Persistence without clarity is survival. Persistence with clarity is strategy. And strategy becomes visible only after someone reaches the goal. Before that, it looks like coincidence. But coincidence becomes pattern the moment someone connects the timeline backward. So let's connect it. First came access. Then came alignment. Then came proximity, which leads to the inflection point. Every life has one. A moment so ordinary at the time that no one realizes it was the hinge on which everything would later swing. A meeting, a relationship, a conversation, a new doorway. Not the royal doorway, not yet. A different doorway. The one that would lead a few steps later to something no one could predict. People always imagine that life-changing moments explode into view. They don't. They unfold quietly. The calm before the shift before the recognition. The recognition before the transformation. And according to those who observed it in hindsight, Meghan's inflection didn't look like destiny. It looked like timing. Perfect timing. Because whatever Phase 2 was designed to achieve, it worked. It didn't propel her to the top, not instantly. It placed her close enough to see where the next level existed. Close enough to understand what separated the visible from the influential. Close enough to enter environments others only admired from a distance. Close enough that the next phase wasn't luck. It was reachable. But before Phase 3 began, something else happened. Something subtle that would matter later. The narrative changed tone. Not publicly. Internally. People who once described Meghan as adaptable began describing her as intentional. That shift matters. Adaptable people adjust. Intentional people direct. And direction always leads somewhere. So if Phase 2 wasn't about the spotlight, if it wasn't about fame, if it wasn't about immediate success, then what was it about? It was about repositioning. Not upward. Forward. Towards someone or something that would redefine the trajectory completely. Because Phase 2 didn't just change the environment. It changed the target. And once the target changed, there was no going back. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Phase 2 wasn't about the spotlight. It was about access. But Phase 3? That's where everything shifted from movement to momentum. Because proximity doesn't change a life. Position does. And according to those who now look back at the trajectory, Phase 3 had one objective: proximity to the right people. Not just anyone. Not just higher status circles. But circles that would open doors no ordinary path could reach. So let's begin with a question that flips this entire chapter. What happens when someone stops trying to enter the world they want and starts entering the world that leads to it? Because that's the difference most people miss. Success doesn't come from chasing a destination. It comes from choosing the gateway. And phase 3 was the gateway. Not to royalty, not yet. Not to global visibility, not yet. But to the kind of social environment where those outcomes become possible. Here's the first thing that changed. Meghan stopped being on the outside looking in. She started becoming someone people noticed inside the room. Not a star. Not a headline. Not a public force. A presence. Presence is not fame. Presence is recognition without introduction. It's when people don't know your whole story, but they remember something about you anyway. And during this phase, Meghan developed exactly that. She wasn't the center of attention. She wasn't trying to command the room. She just belonged in rooms she hadn't belonged in before. That shift doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when someone learns a skill most people never master. Social fluency. Not charm. Anyone can be charming. Fluency. The ability to read tone, match energy, mirror expectations, adapt without losing composure. It is the soft power that opens the hardest doors. And Meghan had it. Even people who don't like her admit it. Even critics say the same thing. She knows how to enter a space and make it work for her. So phase 3 wasn't about transformation, it was about activation. Her environment didn't just change. Her access level did. But here's where the irony begins. Most people think rising into higher social circles makes life easier. It doesn't. It raises the stakes. Because the more selective the environment, the more pressure there is to maintain the version of yourself that gained entry in the first place. And that's where the first cracks quietly formed, not publicly, but internally. Because when someone keeps moving forward without stopping long enough to anchor themselves, they eventually face a difficult reality. Growth without grounding turns into acceleration without stability. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're still in the rise, the exhilarating part where every new door feels like a sign that the universe is finally responding. During this phase, Meghan's world expanded rapidly. Not in fame, in access. Connections that led to introductions. Introductions that led to visibility. Visibility that led to opportunity. It was the kind of progress that feels natural in the moment, but unbelievable when traced backward. And that's when something else shifted, something subtle, but defining. Her standards changed, not in a superficial way, in a directional way. It wasn't, how do I fit into this world? It became, which world will take me to the next one? That question changes people. Ambition is no longer about achievement. It becomes about alignment. And alignment is where strategy finally becomes visible. Because someone who once adjusted themselves to their environment now expects the environment to match them. That's the moment when confidence turns into trajectory. And trajectory is a point of no return. But let's slow down. Because before phase 3 accelerated, there was a moment, a small one, that shifted everything. The moment that separated adaptation from ambition. Someone enters a room. Someone meets a person. Someone has a conversation that doesn't feel important. Until years later, when it becomes the hinge of their entire future. Every major life change begins with a moment people mistake as ordinary. And according to those who later mapped Meghan's timeline, that moment didn't look like fate. It looked like timing. Perfect timing. The right person at the right moment. not because of chance, but because proximity finally intersected opportunity. But here's the twist. This phase wasn't smooth. People imagine upward momentum as clean and glamorous. It wasn't. There were setbacks, rejections, pauses, attempts that didn't lead anywhere. But something was different now. Failure didn't slow her down. It sharpened her. Only two kinds of people react that way: those with nothing to lose, and those who already see something worth reaching. Meghan wasn't acting like someone gambling. She was acting like someone investing. And investments take time. Phase 3 was time, not immediate payoff. Foundation. Because before someone breaks into a new world, they first have to survive the transition between where they used to be and where they aren't yet. That space is the most dangerous place in any transformation. It is the space where most people quit. But Meghan didn't. She accelerated. And the acceleration didn't lead to fame. It led to the one thing people now look back on with new suspicion: upward mobility that didn't match the visible steps. It wasn't impossible. It was faster than expected. And speed always raises questions. How did she get there? Who opened the door? What changed behind the scenes? But at the time, no one asked those questions. Because the world hadn't connected the dots yet. It only connected them later, after Doria's alleged remark reframed the entire timeline. Because once someone suggests planning, people start reinterpreting history, not based on what happened, but based on what might have been intended. And intent changes everything, especially when the next phase isn't about access, but about targeting. Because phase 3 didn't just expand Meghan's world. It pointed her toward a new one she hadn't entered yet, one few people ever do. And once that shift happened, there was no going back. Because the moment her trajectory pointed upward, not socially, but strategically, the next phase became inevitable. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. So now the trajectory had changed, not just in motion, but in direction. Phase 3 wasn't about climbing randomly. It was about moving with purpose toward a world most people only observe from the outside. But here's where the pressure quietly shifted. Because when someone begins entering higher-level spaces, something unexpected happens. The past starts shrinking. Not physically, not literally, but emotionally. Old environments no longer fit. Old relationships no longer align. Old versions of yourself no longer match the future you're stepping into. People think reinvention happens publicly. It doesn't. It happens in silence, long before anyone notices. And during phase 3, Meghan began doing something that separates strategic individuals from everyone else. She stopped letting her circumstances define her identity. Instead, her identity began defining her circumstances. That psychological reversal is rare. It is the moment when someone stops adapting to the world and starts expecting the world to adjust to them. And when someone reaches that mindset, two things happen simultaneously. Their confidence increases, and their tolerance decreases. They stop entertaining environments that limit them. They stop participating in relationships that don't elevate them. They stop settling for outcomes that don't match their internal narrative. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just decisively. That decisiveness was the turning point. Because phase 3 wasn't the moment Meghan became different. It was the moment she stopped pretending she wasn't. But with every advancement, there is a cost. People don't talk about that part. They celebrate transformation, but they never acknowledge the side effect. The distance. Not physical distance, emotional distance. The more someone accelerates, the fewer people can keep up. And as phase 3 unfolded, Meghan entered a space where the people around her shifted again, not in volume, but in relevance. Some fell away. Some were replaced. Some stayed in the background, but not the inner circle. And that's the part that later becomes important. Because when someone rises through proximity rather than sudden exposure, they end up surrounded by observers, not witnesses. Observers see the outcome. Witnesses see the evolution. And Meghan had more of the former. Which means when the public later tried to piece together her timeline, there were fewer voices able to say, "I was there the whole time." That absence created a vacuum. And vacuums always get filled with speculation, assumptions, theories, projections. Not because people are malicious, because humans cannot resist filling silence. So when Doria allegedly spoke years later, even in the smallest way, it didn't land like new information. It landed like missing context. The kind of context people didn't know they needed until it arrived. But before that moment, long before anything surfaced, Phase 3 continued unfolding in its quiet, intentional rhythm. And here's where the narrative takes a sharper turn. Until now, Meghan was moving toward elevation. But in this phase, something changed. She stopped moving toward a world and started moving toward a type of world. A world defined by status, visibility, influence, and selective access. Not celebrity circles, not mass market fame. A different tier. The space occupied by people who don't just succeed, they are positioned to succeed. There's a difference. Celebrities are visible. Influential people are insulated. Celebrities are recognized. Influential people are remembered. Celebrities depend on public approval. Influential people depend on private alignment. And Phase 3 positioned Meghan closer to the second group. Not fully inside it. Not yet. But close enough to understand the rules. And once someone understands the rules of a world above them, they can do something powerful. They can prepare for entry before anyone notices. This is where the transformation became undeniable. Her social connections shifted upward. Her romantic alignments became more strategic. Her lifestyle began matching the future rather than the past. People later described it as reinvention. But reinvention wasn't the goal. It was the side effect. Because the real objective became proximity to power. Not political power, not royal power. Personal power. The kind of autonomy that comes from being able to decide your future rather than inherit it. But with every step upward, the margin for error shrank. Because once someone enters a trajectory based on timing, every decision matters. One wrong association. One stalled opportunity. One miscalculated pivot. Momentum can collapse faster than it formed. And this is where the stakes quietly intensified. Not because Meghan was failing. Because she was close. Close enough that the next phase wouldn't just elevate her. It would transform her life permanently. But before that leap, something else happened. Something no one noticed at the time, but everyone noticed later. Her story stopped matching her surroundings. Not outwardly, inwardly. The world she came from and the world she was moving toward no longer aligned cleanly. That kind of shift doesn't create drama immediately. It creates tension. Silent tension. And silent tension always leads to one of two outcomes. A breakthrough, or a break. But this one led to the breakthrough. Because Phase 3 wasn't where Meghan reached her destination. It was where she identified it. For the first time, the future stopped being abstract. It became specific. Not in the form of royalty. Not in the form of marriage. Not in the form of global attention. In the form of possibility. She could now see the next world. Not from a distance, but at eye level. And once someone sees a world they want, they don't go back to the one they came from. They move forward. Even if the path isn't visible yet. Even if the timing isn't clear yet. Even if the price hasn't revealed itself yet. Because the moment ambition connects with possibility, the future stops being optional. And that is where Phase 3 ended. Not with success. With direction. A direction that would lead her into the next chapter. The chapter where proximity turns into opportunity. And opportunity turns into destiny. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Some people meet by chance. Others meet by timing. But there is a third category, far more rare, far more unsettling to consider. People who meet at the exact moment when two separate trajectories are about to collide, and neither one will ever look the same again. That's what makes this phase different from everything that came before. Because Phase 1 was preparation. Phase 2 was proximity. Phase 3 was direction. But Phase 4, the moment Meghan entered the outer edge of the royal orbit, did not happen because of fate. It happened because timing and opportunity finally intersected. And when timing intersects opportunity, nothing looks accidental anymore. So let's start with the question that reshapes the entire narrative. Was Meghan's connection to the royal circle a coincidence? Or the result of every phase leading her there? We may never know the truth. But the pattern is impossible to ignore. Before this moment, Meghan's world had already shifted upward, socially, professionally, and personally. She wasn't famous yet, but she wasn't anonymous anymore. She was somewhere in between, and that space is where unexpected introductions happen. Not because someone is lucky, because someone is finally visible to the right eyes. Visibility is not fame. Visibility is placement. And placement is what changes everything. Because here is the truth no one likes to admit. People don't get discovered when they're talented. They get discovered when they're placed. And during this phase, Meghan was finally placed where destiny or strategy could reach her. But before the world jumps ahead to the fairy tale, let's slow down. Because the beginning of this chapter wasn't magical. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even romantic. It was quiet, unremarkable at the time. Just another moment in a timeline that didn't reveal its significance until much later. That is how most life-changing encounters work. Not with fireworks, but with subtlety. Someone is invited somewhere they wouldn't have been able to enter 2 years earlier. Someone meets someone who knows someone who matters later. Someone appears in the right conversation, not because they demanded attention, but because their presence no longer felt out of place. That was the shift. Meghan wasn't forcing access anymore. She belonged in the spaces she entered, and belonging changes the rules. Because when someone belongs, people stop questioning how they got there. They only question what comes next. But here's the irony. Even at this stage, nothing about Meghan's life suggested royalty. Not publicly, not socially, not structurally. There was no direct line, no visible path, no clear connection. Which is why, years later, when the world tried to trace the origin of her royal link, the beginning seemed blurry. Not because it was hidden, because it wasn't remarkable at the time. The world only cares about the beginning after it knows the ending. And that's what happened here. People went back searching for signs, clues, foreshadowing, evidence that the royal encounter was inevitable instead of unlikely. But that's not how these moments unfold. The truth is much simpler. A life enters a new orbit gradually, until suddenly, it doesn't. Everything looks normal right up until the moment it becomes historic. And according to those who later studied the sequence, Meghan's entry into royal proximity wasn't a leap. It was a step that felt small then, a step that became monumental later. But before we go further, we need to understand something essential. Phase 4 was not about Harry. Not yet. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about fairy tale narratives, global intrigue, or royal shockwaves. It was about something more subtle and far more strategic. Access to a world governed by a different set of rules. Because once someone enters that world, even on the edges, their life stops operating under ordinary logic. Every relationship becomes symbolic. Every choice becomes amplified. Every association becomes interpreted as intention, whether true or not. And that pressure doesn't appear instantly. It creeps in, shifts slowly, builds quietly, intensifies invisibly, until one day, the person standing in the middle realizes that the world watching them isn't cheering anymore. It's analyzing. And analysis is where narratives begin to fracture. But that part comes later. Right now, we are still at the moment before the shift. Before the story becomes recognizable, before the world realizes that what looked like coincidence was actually the first step toward a global storm. Here's what changed during this phase. Meghan entered a social ecosystem that operates differently from every other sphere. It is not celebrity-driven. It is not achievement-based. It is lineage-based. People don't rise through popularity. They rise through proximity. Not just proximity to individuals, but to legacy, tradition, and hierarchical influence. It is a system designed to protect itself from unpredictability, which makes what happened next even more significant. Because Meghan did not enter this orbit through inheritance. She entered through timing. And timing is the only variable the system cannot control. But someone else could. Not necessarily Meghan. Not necessarily anyone around her. Sometimes timing is its own force. The world shifts. Institutions modernize. Tradition faces pressure. Narratives weaken. And into that moment walks someone who wasn't supposed to be part of the story. That is where Phase 4 truly began. Not with a meeting. Not with a romance. Not with an invitation. With possibility. The possibility that the royal world, after centuries of rigidity, was finally vulnerable to change. And change always enters through the most unexpected door. But here's the part no one saw at the time. Phase 4 didn't bring clarity. It brought contradiction. Because even as Meghan's path moved closer to the royal circle, there was something else happening behind the scenes. A tension between who she presented herself as and who people expected her to be. Not in a negative way, in a structural way. Because the royal world isn't built for individuality. It is built for conformity. And someone whose identity evolved through reinvention was now approaching a world where identity must remain frozen. The collision was inevitable, but not yet visible, because right now, in this moment of the story, everything still looked manageable, promising, intriguing, full of potential. No warning signs, no fractures, no public skepticism, just momentum. Momentum that would soon grow too fast to control. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Momentum is a strange thing. It feels invisible while it's building, and undeniable once it takes over. Phase 4 wasn't the moment Meghan became part of the royal story. It was the moment the royal story became possible. But possibility is not reality. Possibility is a doorway someone can step through or walk past. And the world still had no idea that Meghan was approaching a threshold that only a handful of people in modern history have ever crossed. Because at this stage, nothing about her life signaled inevitability. There was no clear pathway. There was no indication of where the trajectory would land. There was no public sign that the story was preparing to shift from individual ambition to global consequence. That's what makes this phase so fascinating.